In Mark 5, there's this weird little line. This woman sneaks up behind Jesus, touches his clothing, and Jesus felt power go out from him. Like as if Jesus is some kind of healing battery where you connect the terminals and you get a jolt of healing electricity. But really, Mark is doing something really fascinating in this passage, where he juxtaposes the healing of two daughters, this woman and the daughter of a respectable but also very respectful man named Jairus, and even the way he's taking those two stories and comparing them to a story across the lake on the other side of the Gentile regions of the Sea of Galilee. I had the chance to talk about this passage recently, uncover some of the context that's buried in there and clues that Mark gives us, and hopefully help us to make sense of not just the power of Jesus, but also the way that Jesus' interactions in the world speak to the ways we think about ourselves and maybe even the ways that we think about our neighbors.
But now Jesus crosses back to the Jewish side of Lake Kinneret. And this time the sailing is much smoother, so that's nice. But when he lands, there's this huge crowd that's gathered to meet him. And then in verse 22, we read that one of the synagogue leaders, a man named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed and pressed in around him. Now, a couple things about Jairus here. He's called a leader in the synagogue in Mark. The technical Greek term here is archisynagogos. It's literally something like the president of the synagogue. So think chair of the board here at Commons. This was an elected position that supported the religious leaders in the synagogue. So highly respected, popular and influential, Pharisee adjacent. The bottom line is, the very first person that Jesus interacts with on this side of the lake is the direct polar opposite of who he just interacted with on the other side of the lake, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Second, Jairus comes to Jesus and bows down before him. Now, do you remember earlier in the series, we talked about some of our misconceptions about Pharisees and different religious groups in Jesus' world? Jairus is a really good example of all that. He's not a Pharisee himself, but he is part of that system. And he certainly does not see Jesus as a threat. He sees him as a godsend, literally. So no religious group is monolithic. And we should learn to welcome people on the terms they offer themselves to us, not on our stereotypes of them, okay? Third, this man is powerful, he's popular, and he's influential. The reason he even gets to Jesus here is likely because the crowd parted way for him when he walked. And yet he doesn't lord that over anyone. He doesn't demand the kind of deference he's probably used to. He's profoundly humble here. He's there on behalf of someone else, someone he loves. Jairus he's a good guy. And if Jesus is good to the man on the other side of the lake, in spite of his status, well, then maybe Jesus is good to this man because of it, right? At least that's the contrast that's being set up here. Of course, it's all just misdirection, though, because as Jesus begins to follow Jairus home, a woman who the text tells us has been subject to bleeding for 12 years, probably some type of menstrual condition, she sneaks up to touch Jesus' garment in the pursuit of some kind of healing. And there's a couple clues in the text here that are pretty intriguing. Verse 26 tells us that she had suffered under the care of many doctors. That's the NIV. This could also be translated, she suffered from many healers. The implication here is possibly that this woman has been abused and defrauded by a lot of people that claimed they were interested in helping her. Second, verse 28 tells us that she thought, if I could just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And that's a reference to a particular mythology that had developed over time. See, Malachi 4 says that the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays or in its streams, or technically the word is kanaf, or wings. And in Jewish culture, based on a command in Numbers 19, Jewish people often wore robes with special tassels or wings, same word, kanaf, as a reminder to follow the ways of God. It was a mnemonic device for them. Over time, though, the rumor began to develop that when the Messiah finally came, that Son of Righteousness would bring healing in his, literal kanaf on the edges of his clothing. So that's what this woman is banking on. This rumor that she's heard, and honestly, why not? I mean, she's tried everything else. So here's our theme. Jesus has just agreed to follow this powerful but very respectful man home. And this woman sneaks up along the ground between the feet of the crowd crushing in to see Jesus, and she steals a healing for herself. Mark says that Jesus felt power go out from him, and so he turns around and asks, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Are you kidding, man? There's like 100 people here. Everyone's touching you. Chill." But Jesus asks again, more forcefully this time, and the woman, knowing the jig is up, falls at his feet, trembling, apologizing, begging for him not to undo what has happened, and says, "It was me." And Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Be freed from your suffering." Now, this word that Jesus uses here, daughter, first, a very familial, loving, caring term, very open and welcoming, but also, you see what he's doing here by using it? Jesus has just elevated this woman on the ground at his feet who has had no one looking out for her good, immediately to the status of the powerful man's daughter who has everyone looking out for her. One over the other, us versus them. This is not a dichotomy Jesus is willing to acknowledge. We are all daughters. And then to drive that home, what happens next is that word comes from Jairus' home that his daughter has died. So Jesus says, look, don't lose hope. This isn't wasted time for any of us. This is good for all of us. Let's keep going to your home where a second daughter is then healed. What's going on here, particularly in the larger context of this quartet of stories around Lake Kinneret? Well, each of these stories tell us something about Jesus, right? Like the way he calms the chaos that surrounds us, and the way he intentionally crosses barriers to care for those on the outside. The way he welcomes opportunities for grace when they interrupt his plans, and the way he follows through with promises of wholeness for all. Any of those stories absolutely could have been their own whole sermon, no doubt. They're beautiful. But together, Mark is doing something really remarkable here. Put it all together. Jesus saves his friends from a storm. And that leads directly into Jesus saving a man who is almost a caricature of everything his friends think of as opposed to God. All of a sudden, the same grace that saved them saves him. Their eyes are wide open. Except then we get back in the boat, right? And we come back home, and it's a little more comfortable and respectable and familiar here. We're on the right side of the lake again, as it were. And immediately, Jesus is greeted by a wealthy, powerful, influential, good man, and now we're back on track, right? Like, this is the Messiah we've been led to expect. Maybe all that Legion stuff really just was a speed bump after all. And yet all of a sudden, along comes this unclean woman. Notice Mark uses the issue of blood on both sides of the lake. And here she comes, sneaking up behind Jesus, scratching and clawing along in the dirt for the grace that she's being denied. And here Jesus happily sets aside his respectable messianic mission with Jairus to make sure that she knows, that we know, that her story is just as important to him as the man the crowds parted their ways for. See, for me, this interaction is almost Jesus saying, do you remember that mind-blowing, boundary-expanding grace you saw on the other side of the lake? All of that is just as necessary here on this side of the lake in your backyard. With your neighbor. And with your uncle you don't understand. With your trans nephew that makes you uncomfortable. Everything you learn about grace there, that's your lesson about grace here. Because the same calming force that overcomes storms and overthrows legions is the same grace that will always make space for the forgotten. In your home, in your neighborhood, in your city, on your planet. There is love overflowing for when you are Jairus and for when you are struggling to be noticed.
Hey, Jeremy here, and thank you for clicking through to watch that video. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can, of course, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that we're posting here on YouTube. You can head to our website at commons.church, and you can find us on all of the socials at Commons Church. You can also join our Discord. There, the community is having all kinds of conversations about how we can encourage each other in the way of Jesus. Head to commons.church/Discord for the invite there. Also, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you and all the ways that you are journeying on this path toward Jesus. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the ways that you contribute to this conversation. Together, we'll see you soon.